Ladies and gentlemen, bienvenue au Comité permanent des affaires autochtones.
Welcome to the
Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I'd like to start, as always, by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. Our business today is with regard to the supplementary estimates. And the main estimates, we will begin that study now. And with us, we have the Minister of Indigenous Services, along with department officials. And the Minister has been given up to 10 minutes to make his opening statement, and then we'll proceed with questions and answers. So, Minister Miller, please introduce your staff and go ahead.
Bonjour, cher membre.
Good morning, members of the committee. First of all, I would like to stress that we are here on the traditional non-ceded territory of the Algonquin people. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the supplementary budgets of the subject supplementary estimates B 2019-20 for Department of Indigenous Services. And I'm here with Sonny Perron, Associate Deputy Minister Philip Thompson, Chief Finance Results and Delivery Officer Valerie Gideon, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, and Joanne Wilkinson, Assistant Deputy Minister Child and Family Services Reform. Since its creation in 2017, our department is working to reduce the socioeconomic gaps to improve access to services for First Nations and Métis. The department collaborates with communities to improve the well-being of Indigenous associations, allowing them to carry out their own service delivery within the community based on their own rhythm. So with this goal, we want to make sure that Indigenous people have the capacity to offer programs and services to their people. And so that means my department's role will no longer be necessary. So we are working with our partners to build that capacity. In order to support us in this essential work, the B supplemental budget for the department 2019-20 envisages about $1 million. That takes the full amount to 13.5 in this fiscal. And half of these additional funds, that's 585 million, is meant to support services to children and families in Indigenous communities. The budget will go from $1.2 million to $1.8 million. You know, this committee has played a key role in bringing to light the underrepresentation of Indigenous children in the Child Protective Services. And after that was changed with C-92, and now the new law concerning First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, it gives an inherent right for Indigenous communities to take care of the protection of children and families within their community.
For this program, $414.9 million supports the implementation of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings from 2016 to September 2019 related to First Nations Child and Family Services by funding agencies based on their actual needs and focusing on activities and programs aimed at preventing children from being taken into care. Our government believes in supporting a prevention-based system where the needs of First Nations children come first. Funding for First Nations Child and Family Services program has more than doubled between 2016 and 2018-19. Since 2016, we've worked with partners to implement systemic remedies in support of the needs of First Nations children. This means taking steps to keep children with their families, to keep them connected with their communities and with their culture. The other two major items presented in the supplementary estimates B are funding to support Jordan's Principle and emergency management service providers. I'd like now to turn to the main estimates for 2020-2021. For the upcoming fiscal year, the department's main estimates are $12.8 billion. This reflects a net increase of approximately $538.7 million, or 4%, compared to last year's main estimates. Further to these estimates, The department also anticipates funding from any investments announced in Budget 2020, as well as future Treasury Board decisions. This additional funding is expected to be accessed through the supplementary estimates process. This year, the department's main estimates reflect a net increase of $483.6 million related to the transfer of individual affairs and lands and economic development programs, as well as internal services from Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. In addition to this, you will see increased funding related to some of the department's core priorities. For example, these estimates reflect an increase of $85.7 million for elementary and secondary education, as well as post-secondary education programs. From 2011, 2012 to 2018-19, actual expenditures in education have increased by about 41.7%. This is reflective of our government's commitment to ensuring every First Nations child has the best start in life and supporting First Nations control of First Nations education. En 2021, vous constaterez que
So you will see that $1.5 billion was devoted to First Nations, and this will be over 10 years. Concretely, 85 First Nations communities have access to this new funding mechanism. During the last fiscal, new communities will have access to these funds in 2021. The 10-year grant is a key component in the government's continuous commitment to develop a new relationship with First Nations and a more flexible funding method for Indigenous communities.
Insight into the department's supplementary estimates B and main estimates documents. We have made and are continuing to make important changes in the relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. While there is still much work to do, our government's historic investments are making a difference in closing the gaps that exist and improving the quality of life of Indigenous peoples, all while advancing self-determination. Before I end my remarks, I would like to briefly update the Committee on COVID-19 as it relates to Indigenous peoples in Canada, as I know you share my concerns about that, and I thank those who attended the meeting with Valerie Gideon this morning for a more detailed briefing, and in fact I would invite further questions should you so choose. Our government is working with all levels of government, including actively supporting Indigenous communities to prepare for COVID-19. This is a matter of the health and well-being of all Canadians. This is a time for jurisdictional cooperation, not divisions. These efforts are supported through federal, provincial, territorial special advisory committee for COVID-19 that is focused on coordination of federal, provincial, and territorial preparedness and response across Canada's health sector for all Canadians, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. The federal government, including Indigenous Services Canada, has multiple systems in place to prepare for, detect, and limit the spread of infectious diseases, including COVID-19 in Canada. In Budget 2019, I would note our government invested $211 million over 5 years, including $79.86 million as the first ever investment for health resiliency and health emergency preparedness on reserve. These investments have enabled First Nations to strengthen their capacity, has allowed us to establish effective interjurisdictional networks, and is supporting us in standing up our work to monitor and manage COVID-19. My officials are working very closely with First Nations communities to support them in implementing their pandemic plans to provide surge capacity where needed and technical assistance as required. The importance of clear, concise, and timely communication and information sharing can't be overstated. We all have a role to play in ensuring that our communications are based on the best science and the clearest of recommendations. Factual, practical, and clear information is essential. We're working with partners to make this information available in Indigenous languages through print, radio, and social media. We have learned from past outbreaks, accurate information is critical, and we all have a role to play in this, in making sure that people are referring to information from trusted sources like governments and community leadership. Les fonctionnaires de mon ministère travaillent avec les directeurs de...
They're working with the directors of the local centered health professionals and nurses through different social networks the medical networks, these public health doctors are working with provincial partners to make sure that the support provided to Indigenous people, whether they're living on reserve or not, they should be fully included in the provincial health system. The department has a network of regional coordinators and emergency management coordinators to work against contagious diseases and public health doctors. Together, these people support First Nations in different provinces and make preparations to face public health emergencies and different measures taken based on needs. Even if on the territories, the basic health services are provided by the territorial governments, my government is working in close collaboration with Indigenous partners and the governments of the territories for do information sharing and to prepare to face COVID-19, while expecting some additional support as needed. Even if we have a rigorous planning and control system and the capacity to intensify our needs, our capacity as needed, we must remain vigilant. Some of the proximity elements, too many people in a restricted space, and health determinants, these can bring about increased risk for certain populations, including Indigenous people. That's why we have to support communities in a continuous manner to make sure that we reduce the risk as much as possible. So I will be pleased at this point to answer your questions, Miigwech.
And we have the first round of questioning at 6 minutes, starting with Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, and your team for being here with us today. We do appreciate. We know you're busy. I have many questions, and as you know, very little time. So I'm going to respectfully ask that you respect my time with concise answers, so I can get through some of my questions, if that's all right. I must say I do have some concerns about your department's plans. There's an old saying, what gets measured gets done. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I would agree that we also like to measure outcomes.
Thank you. The most recent departmental results report issued by your department, if you look at some of the summaries in GC Infobase, identifies there are 65 indicators used to measure the performance of your department. Only 13 of those indicators are identified as having been met at the time of that report. That's a 20% success rate. Would you consider that to be acceptable?
What I consider unacceptable is the socioeconomic gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The investments that we have made, MP Vidal, are historic, but they are but a start in closing that socioeconomic gap, and it would be wrong to state that this is something that can be achieved overnight or in one term. Those indicators, if any of my team wants to speak to them, I would encourage them to do so, but this has to be put in a much, much broader context.
44 of the indicators, meaning are considered unspecified, meaning that the targets have either not been set nor results have not been measured for some reason. Even in the 2021 plan, which was just released, many of these same targets have still not been met. Not been met, they've not been set, sorry. We're 3 years into this now. I understand your comments about investing, and I appreciate that, but we're talking a 66% increase in almost $18 billion now in your 2021 plan compared to 2015-16. Even the PBO report this morning that was issued, and I quote, it says, it is difficult to determine whether services improved as a result of the increased total budgetary spending. I guess I would challenge you, do you feel Indigenous people are actually being well served by your department when there seems to be very little expectation that the targets will actually be met or even be set?
Well, I think in the global context, those investments, while they are historic and shouldn't be understated, are addressing a cost of inaction that has existed over decades. We have closed the financial gap with, in terms of education on reserve. That is something that all Canadians should be proud of. The results will come, and we know that the graduations are the same or above non-Indigenous graduation rates when that gap is closed and when that devolution occurs to Indigenous communities with respect to education or any other matter. These are ambitious goals, and I will concede that. I would ask that my staff talk about those indicators specifically, but there is a cost to inaction, and we see that every day. There's also a cost to action, and that's precisely what we've implemented.
One of the challenges in establishing targets is that when we are co-developing policies and program, we also work with partners to establish what will be the targets, the rhythm, and the measurement that we will follow going forward. For some, for example, on education, we still have work to do with partners to get to the definitive measurement, but the tools and the process are being measured, they are in place. But before we are able to publish and definitively say this is the target, we have to have the mechanic done and the partnership developed with First Nation and Inuit and Métis when it's applicable to establish that. We have, for example, put money forward for a 10-year funding on the First Nation health survey that will provide us with some data. We did the same thing last year, confirmation of ongoing long-term funding for the Inuit health survey. So we are putting in place the mechanism that will allow the department to report on progress against the indicator and establish targets that are agreed upon with the partners. You've probably seen on the tuberculosis, for example, last year, there was an announcement of what is the target, what we are planning to achieve, a 50% reduction by 2025 in elimination in the territories in partnership with Inuit and territorial government by 2030. So it's ambitious, and we are putting the measurement in place to support the reporting on these.
Thank you. Let me move on to a very specific example of your targets. The indicator identified as percentage of First Nations and Inuit communities with access to mental wellness services was set at 50% with a target to be achieved by March of 2020, and that was in the 2019-20 department plan. In the 2021 department plan, that target now has been adjusted from 50% down to 34% with a target of March 21 instead of March 20. A lower target, a longer time to get there. I use this as an example because it's an indicator of many of the measurements and the indicators in your plan. I guess my question is, why are so many targets adjusted each year to match performance instead of performance being adjusted to get to the targets? In my world, I always expected performance to reach targets. I didn't adjust my targets to match performance.
30 seconds.
Valerie, do you have any information about the change on the mental health?
For sure. So the mental wellness teams have been substantially increased, but for sure some of the mental wellness teams, and they're all set up by First Nations. They're driven by First Nations. The makeup of them, where they're located, all of that is determined by First Nations. And some of the leadership processes to get to the place where the decision was made as to where they would be established took a bit longer, particularly in some of the more complex provinces where there are many players that participate in those conversations. We also were able to negotiate some innovative partnerships, such as in Ontario, where they're co-funded now by the province, which has enabled us to double the number of mental wellness teams. But realistically, it has meant that it's taken a little bit longer for those teams to be set up.
Thank you.
So we've adjusted the target with our partners.
Our next round goes to Ms. Zan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So thank you very much, Minister, for being here again today. I'd like to move to water, drinking water in particular. Co-developing and investing in distinctions-based community infrastructure plans and addressing critical needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities includes working in collaboration with partners to identify public water and wastewater system needs, develop infrastructure capital plans, and design and implement management plans for the operation and maintenance of clean water and wastewater systems. So as World Water Day approaches, I've always said that clean air and clean water are really human rights. So how does government plan to lift all long-term drinking water advisories on reserve by 2021? What challenges do we need to overcome? And how is government going beyond this commitment to proactively work on sustainable water and wastewater systems?
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent question. From day one, this government, as a budget 2016, invested a multi-billion-dollar envelope to address the unacceptable long-term water advisory situation on reserves in Canada. To date, we have removed 88 long-term advisories, as well as having prevented a number of them. The larger projects, which required build-up time, and you will concede a very short period for an unacceptable situation, remain to be lifted, and we're very confident with the coming summer and the coming months to be able to lift a great number of them. I would remind this committee, because I think it's very important, that as of September 30th, 2019, so as of a few months ago, more than $1.3 billion of targeting funded has been invested to support 574 water and wastewater projects, including 265 that are now completed. These projects will serve close to 500,000 people. These are projects that are complex in nature because of the geological situation, remoteness of communities, a variety of reasons. We, cognizant of that, have always looked at the indicators and the constantly moving scenario as opposed to simply investing a large amount in infrastructure in 2016. We were constantly engaged with communities that we talked to on a weekly basis to ensure update and partnership. We knew that, and going into budget 2019, we invested hundreds of millions of dollars into operations and maintenance of these facilities because we knew that these facilities took work and dedication of people that are now the pride of their community. There's a lot of work to be done, and that's why I've asked my team in particular to focus on what the issues that we may be facing right now so that we're not facing them in the spring of 2021, which we remain absolutely committed to.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned about the remoteness of many of these areas. So when it comes to the health status of Indigenous people, that also plays a large part, as we know. So significant gaps still persist in the overall health status for Indigenous peoples compared to non-Indigenous peoples. And the First Nations and Innu face specific challenges that have been a reason for these health inequalities, or one of the reasons. So, including access to the health services close to where they live. So, can you please explain to us what challenges exist with accessing culturally appropriate care close to their homes, and how and where government is investing in partnership with Indigenous communities to close this gap in the health outcomes?
Well, thank you again, and I will split my time with Valerie Gideon because I think she would have some important elements to add on this. The budget that this department administers resembles and mirrors that of a province. It administers healthcare, education, emergency management, and infrastructure. The key areas that are, to your point, which are social determinants of health. They guide everything that underpins the unacceptable socioeconomic gap that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. This is a multi-pronged approach that has to be done in partnership with Indigenous communities. When it comes to healthcare, there are specific needs, as we well know, in Indigenous communities. There is, frankly, well-deserved skepticism with proof as to how Indigenous communities have been let down. And so working in partnership with Indigenous communities to make sure that the health approaches are culturally sensitive is not only important policy, it affects the scientific outcome of the health benefit, and it's key in a lot of areas. It's also why the Prime Minister has asked me to put forward health distinctions-based health legislation, because we know that the outcomes are better when Indigenous peoples are input into their own health. It's almost axiomatic. The investments that we've put in through the various, the last 4 budgets are enormous, but there is an enormous gap, as you mentioned, to close. That is building hospitals, making sure that there are health workers in place, making sure that there is access, particularly in remote areas. Having a specific need with respect to those remote communities, whether you need to fly someone in or out, is very expensive, but it's key in ensuring that the health outcomes are at par with, if not higher than non-Indigenous peoples. And I would just ask Valerie to add a bit of flavor, color on that, please.
There's really not
Just
that
a
much
few
more that I
seconds
can
left.
say.
Go ahead.
Pardon me?
We're very close.
few
We're over
seconds.
time now, but if you can just sum up quickly.
I'll just say that what we're hearing from First Nations is that they want to control their health services that are delivered to their community and have greater influence around services where they have to go external to their community to access those services. So there is funding, over $70 million since 2018, to support some key projects, including in Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba, that are being led by First Nations to transform the system.
Madame Bérubé, vous avez la parole. 6 minutes.
Madame Berube, you have the floor, 6 minutes. So, good morning. Mr. Miller, you said earlier that you had developed more surveys within indigenous communities. This morning, somebody said that Gilles Berube, a businessman from Lac Saint-Jean, got rich at the cost of the communities. For 20 years, this unscrupulous person has taken advantage of the Waskanegan Corporation, which is subsidized by the government of Quebec and Canada, to build a business empire. And the indigenous people living out of the reserves and the Métis, this is scandalous, it's disgusting. I can't even find words to describe this. This is so painful in terms of people living on reserve and out of reserve. Just one example of the impact of this scandal. There is a lady from Sipet, from the North Shore, and she's working with the Waskanegan. She had to renew her housing, renovate her housing, but she simply wanted to change her windows to avoid catching a cold. And the corporation came up with all kinds of fake excuses. And this winter, the lady was freezing because a businessman was getting rich with the taxpayers' money. This is being done with our money. We are responsible for this in the long run. The government must be accountable to this lady and the other victims of Gilles Berube. Mr. Miller, what will you do to make sure that this lady doesn't go freeze throughout the winter and that such a situation doesn't occur again? You're right. It's an unacceptable situation. Based on the facts, I think that this is under the purview of the Quebec and Canadian Housing Corporation. That's not within my area of jurisdiction. We have several ways of verifying these things, and we rely heavily on the indigenous communities. One of the main aspects of my mandate is to rely or to consult, to do some devolution towards indigenous communities so that they can make their own choices. They have the information on the ground to make the right decisions. It is within their rights because it is their money going back to them in order to make these decisions. When it comes from government departments, be it Canada or Quebec, things that are within our purview, we do have verification mechanisms, but there are some aberrations, and what you're mentioning is one of them. Also, another report was that in the apartment, there was a certain Mr. Mac Roy and a bit me, Tamis coming, his ceiling was destroyed because of water leaks and moisture, and he doesn't have enough money to repair his apartment. You're saying that the departments in Quebec and Canada can do something, but what can these verification processes do to avoid these kinds of issues from arising? Maybe Sonny should speak. I'm not trying to minimize what you're saying. These are aberrations. We will get into some verifications in some of the envelopes we provide in partnership with the First Nations. The First Nations are the most audited financially across Canada, and our audit mechanisms and transparency regulations are such that we have several mechanisms within the envelopes in terms of the rest of Canada. Sometimes they are even over-audited. These are aberrations that exist, but these are very unfortunate events. We have mechanisms to counter that. As I said, these are aberrations. These things happen. Now, the situation you are raising, we don't really know much beyond what we heard in the media this morning. The role of the Ministry for Indigenous Services concerns mostly housing on reserves in Quebec. There is a creative, innovative process in partnership with the First Nations. Every year there's a planning session involving the non-convention communities to build capacity. We've even developed partnership with the Assembly of First Nations in Quebec and Labrador. There is a certification process for managers of housing on reserves in order to improve the capacity. As the minister said, we provide funding. There is more need than what we can supply, but we are confident that the local capacity is there in terms of housing and groups that can solve some of the issues you're mentioning, or maybe housing that is managed by the community but not funded by the government. The needs are there. You can be sure that we are paying close attention to that in Quebec and other areas. So how much money does the federal government provided in supporting these corporations? You're saying it is off reserve, so I can't tell you. I'm telling you what I learned from the media. In Quebec in housing, the department or the ministry spends about $18 million. Thank you.
And Mr. Johns,
Thank
6
you,
minutes.
Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here with your team in light of this historic crisis that we're facing right now. You know, we want to talk about many issues, but right now, with the pending crisis that's right before us, we have important, timely questions around the disaster preparedness for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We're going to focus on, things that we're hearing. Constantly we're hearing from your government, actually, and from your party, is that more needs to be done. And right now, with the concerns we have with COVID-19, the advice Canadians and Indigenous people are getting is wash your hands and self-quarantine. So many communities don't even have running water to be able to deal with this crisis, or there's overcrowding in homes that would stop, and help with self-quarantine and certainly stop the spreading. Can you talk about concrete steps that your government is taking right now to support Indigenous communities facing this crisis?
Thank you, MP Johns, for the question. A very, very important question, and important to highlight that there are distinctions. Obviously, Indigenous populations are much more vulnerable for the reasons that you highlighted: overpopulation, overcrowding in housing, health outcomes that are lower than Canadians, than non-Indigenous Canadians, and access to and to healthcare in a culturally sensitive fashion. In terms of the specific measures that I highlighted in my introduction, the $79 million for emergency preparedness. Also, with the Prime Minister's announcement, $100 million of which First Nations can access in tandem with the amounts that were supported for provincial and territorial governments. The specific issues that you raised are very, very important, and we have not only surge capacity that we're working at internally in providing and getting out to communities. The fact that we have access to it and they have access to it should something arise, and that
they're not hearing it. They're not getting that message. They heard about the announcement yesterday. So I'm just getting a message right now from the new Chalmers Tribal Council president, and all they got is the announcement. They haven't seen any of this, and they don't know what's going on. They have questions, and this information has got to get out there.
You're absolutely right, and we have actually reached out directly into health centers and to health providers. Sometimes that information doesn't necessarily get back to leadership, and we can work on actually getting that information there, and then directly into the public.
Can't get to the people if it doesn't get to the leadership.
I would ask Valerie to step in on that, because there was a briefing to all parliamentarians given this morning and some very important details. So I'd ask her to elaborate a bit on it, because it's a very important question.
Sure, absolutely. And within BC, the First Nations Health Authority actually is managing the planning and the preparedness and the response efforts. They're the ones that have been communicating with BC First Nations communities directly, because they have that direct responsibility. We are, however, engaging them in every single one of our calls and all of our meetings with respect to the national preparedness efforts. I even myself wrote last night to the CEO of the First Nations Health Authority to talk again about the announcement and how we will ensure that
will you be
First
willing
Nations
to follow up with me tomorrow to make sure that this message has got to the nations in my writing? Because clearly it's not right now.
I can confirm with you absolutely what communications FNHA has sent out.
Certainly when it comes to speaking of the urgency, does this not highlight the sense of urgency to make these critical investments that we're talking about and accelerate your timelines? When it comes to Indigenous housing, making sure that you've got Indigenous housing in not just on reserve, but of course, off reserve, urban and rural and northern housing. This is critical right now. Is the government looking at accelerating it in light of the crisis?
Given the options that we have before us, what we're looking at in case that there is an outbreak and there is a necessity to self-isolate is the optionality of having isolation tents, the ability of having increased personnel to address specifically overcrowding. And it is unacceptable. I think all Canadians need to realize the level of overcrowding that exists in Indigenous communities. We have made historic investments, but given the timeline that you're describing, the most expedient thing is to increase our capacity and to have a sensitive and appropriate approach, in particular to hand washing, but also the capacity to self-isolate. We know that the communities are more vulnerable, and that's why we're dedicating additional resources to that.
I look forward to seeing that happen. With regards to healthcare in Indigenous communities, especially in rural and remote areas, difficulty around transportation is something that we're hearing, and concerns, especially with the ice roads closing really soon. We also know that 40% of clinics have critical property issues. What's the department planning for the worst case scenario in these communities?
And 1 minute.
Again, Gord, we have a staged approach, and we, as the Prime Minister has mentioned, money is not an issue. This is about getting surge capacity in place and a staged approach if and when issues occur in community. Again, it has to be appropriate to the community. We have to have that proper level of engagement and community.
We're happy to hear that money's not an issue. When we talked about disaster relief and evacuations like we're seeing in Saskatchewan, who will be evacuated, as we know, in the coming weeks because of spring flooding, what are the plans to make sure people are kept safe, and not only in the process of evacuation, but also for those people temporarily living in an urban centre they might not be familiar with?
30 seconds, Minister.
Just a clarification, are you talking about Saskatchewan and with respect to coronavirus or respect with
it's
potential flood?
It's going to be a combo because you're going to have to move them with spring flooding anyways. And what's the plan there?
Again, we're engaging with every community, and Saskatchewan is not the only community at risk. And should communities be at risk, we'll be prepared to intervene in a way that isn't simply with respect to flooding, but also with respect to medical needs if the tandem occurrence of an outbreak occurs at the same time, which would be obviously
it's going to happen,
unfortunate.
likely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we go back now to a 5-minute round, and starting with Mr. Zimmer.
Thank you, Minister, for coming. And I wanted to say thanks to Valerie for giving us a briefing on the coronavirus as it relates to Indigenous communities. I think the only question that I brought to you again this morning was the screening, because we're members of Parliament. We travel a lot. I travel through YVR on a regular basis. Zero screening, and to me, it's problematic when we see planes, from many countries around the world. China Eastern comes into Canada, and there's no screening. And my concern, as it relates to Indigenous communities, it can easily transmit to those communities if there is no screening process in place. So, on the preventative side, what are you doing to prevent coronavirus from getting into those communities?
So one of the measures, of course, is particularly for individuals that need to travel out in order to be able to access medical care. Like during H1N1, that was the source of some of the first exposure, particularly in remote and isolated communities where people traveled out and they went to urban centers and then they came back home and they had contracted H1N1. So what's important for us is to ensure that particularly those more vulnerable clients will be able to access private transportation, private accommodation measures so that they're avoiding, to the extent possible, more group settings, right? But absolutely, I think education of individuals about presenting for testing if they are symptomatic, right? And I understand your point about why is not everybody being tested, but that would really cripple and paralyze the system. And you're not infectious until you're presenting symptoms.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I'll give the rest of my time to Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our Minister for being here today. Minister, it's well known that Indigenous women are by far the highest represented victim group in human trafficking in Canada. While in fact, Indigenous women make up only 4% of the women population in Canada, a 2014 report from the Canadian Women's Foundation established that at least 50% of the female victims of sex trafficking in Canada were Indigenous. In Winnipeg, it was more like 70 or 80%, and in Edmonton, a city near where I live, it's 40 to 50% of sex victims are Indigenous women. Now, last fall, your government announced a national strategy to combat human trafficking with funding. I'm just wondering if you have any idea why your department was left out on that funding initiative.
Well, I think the issue you raise is an immensely compelling one and distressing one. It was highlighted most notably in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's report, and it's something that in fact, we can talk about different department responsibilities. That preparedness for that falls under the Minister Bennett's mandate. It doesn't prevent me from speaking to it. Clearly, we know from the report that access to shelters, accompaniment when traveling, is key. Awareness in communities is also of capital importance, given the statistics that you raised. And are clear in the public's mind. We need to address these issues in a community-wide basis. That includes clear issues with respect to policing, which is in my mandate letter, and it is Minister Blair's mandate letter. Issues with respect to accompaniment in various medical situations when women are most vulnerable and when traveling, and this is something we've addressed. And we also have needs for increased shelters on and off reserves, which we've proceeded to invest in and will continue to do so. This is a multi-pronged approach, and we know because of the precarity, particularly of Indigenous women, to violence, which accompanies human trafficking also is a characteristic of it, that it is one of the issues that we have focused quite heavily on in our upcoming action plan, but also as a whole of government approach to address this, which is entirely unacceptable.
Earlier this week, the all-party group to end modern-day slavery and human trafficking, which I co-chair, hosted a panel of experts and survivors. One of the panelists was Diane Redsky, and she's the executive director of an NGO that operates the only traditional healing lodge in Canada for the victims of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Now, the National Inquiry, which you mentioned, into murder and missing Indigenous women and girls, urged funding for this kind of support services for Indigenous women and girls to help them escape. I'm wondering if there's any funding from your department that is going to aid this healing lodge.
We're right at time, briefly, or we can pick it up in a later round.
There's broad funding. I think people should await the action plan, but even before the action plan is announced this coming summer, there's been money invested in a number of these initiatives.
Thank you. Mr. Batiste for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, Minister Miller, and I was pleased to hear that we've got an increase of $86 million going into education. My question is going to be around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and funding education for that. And I want to quote Murray Sinclair when he said, "While Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathens, savages, and pagans, and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country." And while on-reserve education is important, we need to invest in capital. There's also, I was there this summer when AFN passed a treaty education resolution calling on a 10-year strategy to promote that across Canada. We've seen places like Saskatchewan that have mandated mandatory treaty education. So what is our government doing to address the TRC's calls to action in terms of talk about all the education pieces? And also, how are we working with Indigenous partners in order to ensure that resources are being developed, training is being developed for teachers, as well as how are we being able to work with our provincial counterparts who control education to make sure that every school in Canada is learning about reconciliation, learning about the residential schools, and learning about inherent and treaty rights?
MP Batista, you raise a very, very important aspect of the mandate that isn't necessarily written in my mandate letter, which is making sure that non-Indigenous Canadians are part of this and educating all of Canada as to the issues that have underpinned and marred the relationship and prevented in some ways from moving forward. Education and communicating to Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, that this is part of who we are and part of our identity is key in your initiative, and I want to salute your initiative and your dedication even before you were an MP to doing this. It is key to moving this forward. If we're only doing it among leadership, we're not exactly succeeding. We may be advancing, but we're not succeeding. It has to be among peoples, and I think that's what the main reminder that all of us need to take home. In terms of funds, I think you'll note that in the 2021 main estimates, the amounts for elementary and secondary education was $2 billion. Financially, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, we've closed the gap in education. It's a very important social determinant of health and key in closing the educational aspect of the socioeconomic gap. With that, the success rates are amazing. There are amazing stories about Indigenous children who should never have been in that situation, in control of their own educational system, and you highlighted that. So Brett, there's a very tainted history that everyone knows with the educational system and residential schools with respect to Indigenous children. When controlled and administered in a culturally appropriate way and sensitive to the community needs, the outcomes are the same, if not better. And the experience with the Mi'kmaq is one example, hopefully one of many. These are key to who we are and key to who we believe we are as a nation, but more importantly in community, making sure that we don't fail another generation of Indigenous children. You mentioned, I mentioned the financial support, and I think it's for all to see in the main estimates, and I won't go on further about that, but making sure that education is done in the language, culturally appropriate, and it isn't simply something you do on a Friday afternoon when everyone's tired. It's a core part of the education. Is key. It's key to what people use as a catchphrase, but a very important one is decolonizing. But it's realizing what the history is of Canada and Indigenous peoples, and with that comes power, and with that comes confidence and success. In the way that First Nations dictate the pace. Obviously, uncertainty comes with that, but that's fine. It's a sign of who we are and how we move that relationship forward. Educating as well, and you touched on that, non-Indigenous Canadians is essential. It's why some of the Truth and Reconciliation reports touched on private actors like institutions and university institutions in endorsing language courses, because everyone needs to realize that we're all on the same land, and no one's going anywhere. But if we want to advance the relationship, it has to be done in mutual respect, cooperation, and friendship.
30 seconds, if you like.
Okay, I'll be quick with this. Just in terms of the COVID-19, do First Nations communities right now have the ability to test in their health centers?
Yeah, so it's a swab that you can take, and then actually it's sent to a provincial lab in most cases, and it can be confirmed through the National Microbiology Lab. I hope you didn't mind that I answered that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much. Thank you. Mr. Schmill, you have 5 minutes.
Actually, Gary again. Vidal.
Gary, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make it clear, you talk a lot about historical investments, and I want to make it clear that I'm not opposed to making investments in Indigenous communities. My concern is that we have accountability and that we are doing it the best that we can when I talk about the measures and the indicators and some of those kind of things. In the 2018 departmental plan, FTEs for 2021 were planned to be 3,740 people. In 1920, that increased to 4,248, and now for 2021, that's up to 5,538 people in your department. That's almost 1,800 FTEs, or a pretty significant percentage. In your departmental plan, you also talk about our work supporting self-determination of Indigenous peoples, so that in the future, the services we offer are developed, governed, and delivered by Indigenous peoples. Again, this morning, I know I've heard you talk about working yourself out of a job, and I get totally where you're coming from on that. But included in this increase in FTEs is an increase for internal services from like 685 people to 1,366. That's like doubling the internal services FTEs. I would suggest to you that Canadians who are struggling to make ends meet would consider that excessive, especially under your goal of extinction, when I'm not sure many would object to the fact those resources got to the ground in First Nation communities. But when we're doubling our FTEs within the bureaucracy in Ottawa, that would be my struggle. And I'm just curious to see if you think that's appropriate and what your response to that would be.
Gary, I acknowledge how hard you're working to get me out of a job. I admire the game, not necessarily the result, but I'm fighting. You'll appreciate I'm doing the same thing. Look, a number, I think we have to compare apples to apples here, and it's key because it leads into the sort of statement that you made. A number of the FTEs reflect the transfer from First Nations Inuit Health Branch over from Health Canada as part of the disaggregation of not only Crown Indigenous Relations, but Indigenous Services Canada, and making sure that First Nations health is treated in a culturally appropriate way. So it came under my ministry. So we need to reflect that as well. And as to the other numbers, and I guess what we would say the penetration rate of the funds into communities, they're very, very high. I would like to turn to them, but I would turn to my officials to give you a little more clarity on that.
Can I, just before you do, I get your response in the change of the departments, but overall there's still about 650 people added to the combined department. So I would keep that in mind in your response.
Most of the increase is coming from the transfer from Health Canada. So if you look at their numbers, you will see a diminution of the First Nation Health branch, plus a bit more than 300 employees that were coming from their internal services that made up the growth into the department. Right now, we are looking at the ratio program versus internal services and program management. We are below 5%. And this is, in fact, a ratio that is better than when INAC was managing these services. So our ratio is really thin. It's around 1% internal services spending overall and around 3% program management. The rest is going directly to communities through transfer or to organizations out there to deliver the services or to direct payment for services like drugs and dental care. So the department is very lean. Our ratio administrative cost versus operation, when it was under INAC, we were talking about something around 40-some%. Now we are running around, if I remember well, 29%? 29%. And at Indigenous Services Canada, I'm pleased to share that with you. As I think it's all right to be concerned about the number of federal employees doing this work with the mandate like we have. But one thing you should be happy to hear is that we are close to 30% of Indigenous people working within this department. A lot of them are executive and are on the ground working. So we are also making progress in terms of representation, because if we want to get rid of this department over time, we need to build a workforce that can help us to transform and transfer the services like we did in British Columbia, for example.
Half a minute, go ahead.
Thank you, I appreciate that. One other very specific question. Again, one of your measures, the percentage of First Nation and Inuit adults who reported to be in very good or excellent health in the 2021 plan. You reduced this target from 50 to 40% to 44%. And this has an expected date of achievement of 2028. That's like 8 years down the road. Again, we're adjusting the targets. Or maybe I ask, are we adjusting the targets to match our performance? Or are we working hard to achieve those targets? I mean, and that target's a long ways down the road.
Briefly, go ahead.
Can I speak to it? So the source of that information is the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey. So it's cyclical over a 4 or 5 year period. That is the reason, but that is a First Nations data source. It's entirely controlled and driven by First Nations. That indicator is actually crafted by First Nations through the First Nations Information Governance Center.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pawlowski, the final round of 5 minutes.
Thank you. H1N1, which is the last COVID-19-like virus to go around, disproportionately affected people in northern Indigenous communities for the reasons you've mentioned, probably usual social determinants of health, lack of water, overcrowding, that kind of thing. But I think there was also probably a genetic component, because being a doctor in Thunder Bay Regional Hospital at the time, we had a lot of ICU beds occupied by people from northern communities, young people who got a H1N1 and were seriously enough ill that they had to be intubated and put on a ventilator. Now that's the ultimate concern with COVID-19 is that proportion of people who have more serious illness. The answer to that, if you're in one of the northern fly-in communities, is fly them out. So in the case of an epidemic, you're going to need probably more planes, better transportation systems. Is that being considered and prepared for?
I'd ask Valerie to answer that.
Just before I jump in. So air ambulance services are through provincial governments, particularly like in Northern Ontario. It's entirely like the Orange contract that is entirely an Ontario contract, which speaks to the absolute importance of ensuring that provincial and territorial governments, particularly provincial governments, are factoring in First Nations communities in their pandemic planning, because what our department can influence is really what's local into the community, and that will not be sufficient at all in terms of a response with respect to COVID-19.
Now, some people in certain provinces seem to have provincial governments that are maybe less responsive to the social and health needs of their communities than other provinces. I won't mention any particular provinces, but what can you do for people who may be in a province, like speculatively Ontario, who may be concerned over their provisional government's lack of responsiveness to something like this, to ensure that people in those northern Indigenous communities aren't left out because of a provincial government that maybe isn't as proactive as we might like?
Yeah, there's to the extent the services and administration hasn't been devolved like in FNHA or in territories, we have had an excellent response rate from provinces. We have joint protocols in many measures to augment and to coordinate amongst each other. What you don't want authorities tripping over each other. I think everyone, and with responsible leadership, is cognizant of the fact that we have to rely on science, check our operational controls and our capacity to surge, and I won't speculate as to unwillingness. I think everyone is on the same page and knows how the emergency and urgency of this pandemic, and at the very least to slow it. There is good to very good communication between governments in ensuring that communities in need get the services that they need when they need it, and should they not, we are prepared to step in aggressively.
I want to change gear and ask about water supply. There seems to be an issue in terms of sudden, unpredicted problems with the water supply and ability to respond quickly to that. For example, the Niskantaga First Nations in northern Ontario was evacuated earlier this year because of a sudden problem with water supply. Things that I've heard that I want to ask your department about was weather, because I've heard this wasn't the case, that there wasn't an inventory of what each First Nation community had in terms of their water purification system, so that when there was a problem, the people in for example, in Thunder Bay that were providing the kind of solutions didn't know what equipment they had up there. And they suggested that there ought to be some sort of inventory so that I'm not sure who it would be, but Indigenous Affairs knows which community has which equipment, so when there's a problem, they're able to rapidly respond. And the second part to that is there didn't seem to be, and there are, I gather, some rapid water purification systems available, and whether that you've contemplated trying to see if we couldn't use those in order to respond to these emergencies so that they didn't have to do things like evacuate communities.
We just have a few seconds. Please go ahead.
We have a wide variety of measures that we can put into place when these issues do arise. The very, very strict standards around water are such that issues do arise more frequently, and we correspondingly respond in a quick way. If you just look at what happened in Fort Severn, we're working quite quickly to dethaw the pipe that froze. These things do arise, and we're ready to act quite quickly. As to the inventory, if we have a second, I'd let my staff respond to the inventory.
Okay, very quickly.
Yeah, we have a good knowledge of recently replaced or built system. For old system, sometimes there has been addition changes that were made and our staff are not aware. So often when there is a problem, someone needs to go there with the technical expertise to determine what is the source of the problem. Is it the pump? Is it the filtration system? Is it the maintenance issue? So at distance, we have some information, but to be really honest, when there is no diagnostic that can be done at the local level, we sometimes have to fly someone in the community to go and try to determine what is the nature of the problem and what are the potential immediate and long-term solution.
Mr. Minister Miller and staff, thank you very much. We've come to the end of this first session, and another important one to come up. And also thanks to our committee for moving things along. We got lots of answers in, and so we'll suspend briefly to set up our next meeting. Welcome again, everyone, as we continue on with this meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Minister of Northern Affairs are both here with us today, and they get 10 minutes each to make opening statements, and then we'll proceed with questions and answers. And a reminder to committee that we do have committee business following the vote on supplementals after we finish today. So, Minister Bennett, would you like to go ahead first?
For sure, and I think because it was the two of us, we've really only, plan on maybe 5 minutes each so that you have longer time for questions, if that's
Committee
okay.
would like that, I'm sure.
But if I go to 5 and 10 seconds, you'll understand. Okay. So thank you, Mr. Chair. It's good to be back. Again, as we gather here today, we want to begin by acknowledging that we come together on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And today, as you know, we're presenting on the 2019-2020 Supplementary Estimates B and the 2020-2021 Main Estimates for Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, or CERNAC. Je borderai mon travail à titre de ministre des Relations courantes.
As a Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations,
Chief of Finance, but also Results and Delivery Officer. So as you know, CERNAC is focused on renewing the nation-to-nation, Inuit to Crown and government-to-government relationships between Canada and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation. At the core of my mandate is to redress historical wrongs and to support the acceleration of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis visions of self-determination. The Department's 2019-2020 Supplementary Estimates B presents initiatives totaling approximately $1 billion, and this brings the total appropriations for the department to $7.1 billion. Almost all of this funding, $919 million, is dedicated to the forgiveness of Indigenous groups' outstanding comprehensive land claim negotiation loan debt. And l'annulation de cette dette retire un obstacle de long.
This will remove a long-standing obstacle in terms of signing agreements on land claims, on global land claims.
Commitment to furthering a rights recognition approach and to concluding these processes in good faith. In fact, Indigenous groups who go on to conclude comprehensive land claim agreements will benefit from increased settlement amounts, as these loans would no longer be deducted from the final settlement. So forgiveness of this debt will also provide additional funds which can be invested in community priorities such as closing socioeconomic gaps or supporting economic development initiatives. These supplementary estimates also access $17.5 million to implement the recommendations of the Kikitani Truth Commission's report, and this funding will support the design, initiation, and long-term viability of program by the Kikitani Inuit Association to implement the Kikitani Truth Commission's final report recommendations. Moving to the main estimate, CERNAC's estimates for 2021 will be approximately $4.9 billion. Je tiens à souligner que le budget principal des dépenses.
I do want to highlight that the main estimates, as I think most of you know, the total of all funding that's already been approved by Treasury Board
of the total spending for the year is just what has already been approved by Treasury Board. So, for instance, we have yet to see the spending that will be outlined in Budget 2020. The Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Act came into effect on July 15th, 2019, establishing CERNAC, and the fiscal year 2020-2021 will be the first main estimates for the new department. The former department's 2019-2020 main estimates was $7 billion, while CERNAC's total main estimate budget for 2021 is $4.9 billion. The apparent net decrease of $2.1 billion reflects a number of settlements that were paid in the current fiscal year with one-time payments and a transfer of $483.6 million to Indigenous Services Canada, which now is primarily responsible for individual affairs and lands and economic development programs. So this actually reflects a tremendous success with the resolution of long-standing historical wrongs, including the 60 Scoop and the McLean Day School settlements. You will see from our main estimates that for 2021, we are putting forth a strong focus on and increased spending for negotiation, settlement, and implementation of comprehensive claims and self-governed agreements. C'est maintenant avec plaisir que je répondrai à...
So now I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Dal like to do his presentation?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to discuss our government's supplementary estimates for the 2019-2020 fiscal year, as well as the main estimates for the 2020-2021 for the Northern Affairs component of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. J'aimerais tout d'abord souligner que nous sommes réunis sur...
To stress that we are here on the unceded lands of the Algonquin people. After a brief opening word, I'll be pleased to answer the committee's questions. Thank you.
Our government's commitment to creating greater economic growth and a higher quality of life in Canada's North and Arctic in a fiscally responsible manner. I am confident that these estimates demonstrate our government's plan to develop long-term opportunities that protect Canada's rich natural environment and build healthier communities, while also protecting the rights and the interests of Indigenous peoples. The supplementary estimates include an additional investment of $12.5 million in Nutrition North Canada, including $8 million to create a harvester support grant, which is designed to be Indigenous-led and will promote local harvesting of foods for distribution to more than 100 isolated communities. We are continuing to work in partnership with key stakeholders and partners to ensure that the unique interests, the priorities, and the circumstances of all Northerners are acknowledged. In fact, we've seen firsthand how direct engagements with Indigenous and community partners has resulted in significant improvements to the Nutrition North program in 2018 and 19.
We are always ready to listen to the inhabitants of the North as far as the importance of traditional food and how to better face the rising cost of hunting and harvest in the isolated communities. Beyond the advantages of using fresh local products, participating in hunting and agriculture, it's a significant aspect of the well-being of these communities and also cultural preservation.
$130 million in spending related to the Northern Affairs component of the department. An amount of $108.50 for Nutrition North is included in the main estimates to continue this important initiative next fiscal year. This funding will address increased subsidy rates and a growing list of subsidized items that includes more culturally relevant and family-friendly items, such as the ingredients important for making bannock, as well as infant formula and diapers. Almost one half of the main estimates total, $253.5 million, is allocated to the ongoing work of the Northern Contaminated Sites Program. This includes the funding of the Northern Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program announced in Budget 2019. As the committee is aware, the Government of Canada is responsible for the management of a portfolio of contaminated sites across the North, the result of private sector mining exploration and resource development activities that were abandoned by their former operators when they became insolvent. These complex projects present serious ongoing risks to the environment and as well as human health and safety. The Government of Canada has accepted fiscal responsibility for this historical contamination and is legally obliged to manage these sites. Together, these and other initiatives, including $52.1 million for climate change adaptation, clean energy, and other measures to enhance environmental sustainability, are intended to ensure northern lands and waters are healthy for future generations, while helping secure jobs for Northerners and Indigenous partners. In closing, I would note that $96.6 million for Northern and Arctic governance and partnerships, and $18.4 million for Northern regulatory and legislative frameworks are also included in the main estimates. These funds will support the implementation of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, including co-development and implementation of an Inuit Nunangat policy, as we work towards the full implementation of Inuit land claims agreements. Je vous remercie du temps que vous m'avez accordé.
So thank you for the time you have afforded me this morning, and I will be pleased to now answer the committee's questions. Thank you.
Ministers, and we go now in our 6-minute round to Mr. Schmale.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ministers, for your appearance again in committee. It's always a pleasure. Minister Bennett, if I could start. On your last paragraph of your report, you read, "You'll see from our main estimates that for 2020-2021, we're putting a strong focus on and increased spending for negotiations, settlements, and implementation of comprehensive claims and self-government agreements." Now, if I look to your main estimates here on page 62, there's about $2 billion here for grants to First Nations to settle specific claims, to your comment. I'm just curious, maybe you could clarify for me, is this to actually money set aside to actually settle these claims, or is it more for lawyers and consultants and that kind of thing? Just for a point of clarification.
That money is to settle the claims. In the new process, we have nation rebuilding money, we have negotiation preparation money, we have the money that supports nations in their discussions with Canada. As you know, in the past, those were done by loans, as we explained before. And then when the claim was settled, Canada took back the money that was in the loan. And so the frustration was that they spent 20 years to be $30 million in debt, and then $30 million was taken away from what ended up being the comprehensive claim settlement. So now the money that's set aside for settlements is actually for the settlements, and that we, as Canada, believe that now our job is to support the financing of those conversations.
Okay, but actually, glad to hear that. Is there any way to isolate how much is for the negotiations itself, or is it total? I just want to be 100% clear. The breakdown of that extra I think it's $2.2 billion.
Maybe. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So, thank you for the question. So, to the extent that it involves departmental staff that would be traveling or being paid salaries to that would be captured in our operating monies, and so it's inside the operating budget of the department and not included in this specific aspect.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that clarification. Now, just going to the overall, if the numbers, what I'm reading, are correct, we're looking at about a 66% increase in overall funding since 2015-2016. But the PBO report out this morning on the estimates, saying, and I'll quote, "It is difficult to determine whether services have improved as a result of increased total budgetary spending." Are there any indicators you have to refute that in terms of the fact that the PBO is saying that increased budgetary allotments doesn't actually improve on reserve living?
So as we were explaining, that some of the increases there are actually for a settlement, and whether that is the Kikatani Truth Commission or whether it's 60 Scoop or Maclean's, these are actually settlements that actually the government has and will pay out. I think that where we now know that because of the changes in policy, so what I described before, spending 20 years $30 million in debt to not get a final agreement was pretty frustrating and not very attractive to nations to participate. Now with particularly the BC policy, which has eliminated cede and surrender extinguishment, these are done on loans, we now have over half of the First Nations at a table, and some of them are just Jamie, wanting to discuss child and family services, some education, the coastal First Nations of fishery. But we are getting more and more people to the table to be able to assert their jurisdiction and work on how they want to implement their Section 35 rights. So now, and that includes the Inuit land claim groups that are working to real self-determination, some of the Métis groups, but over 400 of the First Nations.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I'm just looking at your departmental plan now, if I could switch quickly to that. It's reading that your ministry has met 18 of its 48 goals. Now, some of these missed targets have been rolled over into future years. Is there a specific plan to address some of these goals that keep getting rolled over into future years rather than kind of aspiring to reach them eventually?
A minute left. Go ahead.
Absolutely, and I think that, I mean, some of the goals where we want more Indigenous employment in the department. We know that in the split of the department, a lot of the Indigenous public servants were in the services side. We want more Indigenous participation on the relationship side. That I think there are issues. We're at 99%, I think, in Indian residential school settlements. We want to get that done and that wound down. But I think that what's exciting about this year is that we actually have been able to achieve some of these difficult things like 60 Scoop and the McLean Day Schools, as well as the Kikitani Truth Commission, and those, I think, were the priorities of our partners, and that we've been able to get those ones done.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Vancouverden for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, ministers, for your presence here today, and moreover, thank you for your long-standing mutual commitments to an authentic consultative process and a commitment to a co-development strategy. My questions will focus primarily on Nutrition North. I was happy to see that there's $8 million going directly for the Harvesters program, and that's something that they identified, and when I refer to that consultative co-development process, that's what I mean. There was a question that arose about the impact of not just physical health but mental health with respect to the opportunity to harvest food traditionally, the experience that goes with it, and regaining some of that lost social knowledge and the opportunities for social cohesion that go with it. Can you provide some insight, perhaps Minister Vandal, on what precisely those monies will go to, and if possible, leave a couple minutes for a follow-up question? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we've been hearing directly from Northerners and from people living in the Arctic for a long time now that food security is a huge issue in the North. Food insecurity is a huge issue in the North. And the Nutrition North program has attempted to be part of that solution towards the food insecurity issue, but acknowledging, first of all, that food insecurity is a larger issue than one program. What is impressive about the Harvesters program is that it was co-developed with Inuits right holders, because it was clear the rising costs of hunting and harvesting in isolated communities was a real issue, as is the rising cost of everything in the North. And it really is a program that offers a subsidy to Northerners and Inuit to hunt, to harvest, to fish, so that more traditional foods are accessible to their families. And it's something that came out of, as I said, was co-developed. I had the opportunity to meet the chairperson of the Nutrition North Advisory Council, Nellie Cornwallier, this week, who gave me quite a history about the Nutrition North program, the challenges and the opportunities. And I think that really is one of the really positive aspects that came out of the co-development. I think the era of solutions for the North coming from the South are over. We want solutions by the North for the North. And as I said, there's $8 million in the supplementary estimates for Nutrition North, and I believe there's close to $100 million in the main estimates, and for Nutrition North, and in there is the Harvesters program, and it's people are eagerly awaiting its rollout.
Can you elaborate a little bit on both the partnership opportunities there are with other organizations? I'm thinking about organizations like the Rangers and perhaps the Guardians and other Indigenous-led organizations to teach some of those skills, but also be a little bit more specific on what the subsidies will be for and how it'll have an impact on the greater Nutrition North program.
For sure. I think there's flexibility built into the program, and in fact, I just concluded a meeting with the Premier of Northwest Territories, Caroline Cochrane, who's in town, and we talked about Nutrition North, and she asked about how flexible is this program, because we would like to put breakfast programs in schools. We would like to talk about community freezers. And I think there's that sort of flexibility built in to the program. As I said, it's co-developed with Inuit rights holders, and so they're at the table. And if there's opportunities for more partnership, for more synergy, that we are 100% for that. As how the money will be administered, I'm not really. Perhaps Deanne could speak on that a little bit.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So part of the co-development process was actually not just the design of the program, but also the funding allocation, recognizing that we are not best placed to determine where the money should be allocated. So part of that has been, for example, in Nunavut, the funding will be administered by NTI because they have the connections to the harvesters groups and the hunters associations and things like that. So they know who's best placed to actually do the harvesting and gathering, and they know what their needs are. So we haven't been specific about what exactly the money will be spent on. We're leaving it to the organizations on the ground who have a much better understanding of what the specific need is. So that's why we're confident the program is going to actually meet those needs. There's also funding that has been allocated to Canmore, where they are going to be undertaking some pilot projects going forward in terms of looking at solutions for food security beyond just the Harvester Support Grant, but like things like community freezers, breakfast programs, and things like that, harvesting and growing things locally. So that's part of the solution too.
Thanks very much. That's the time. And Madame Bérubé, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Madam Minister, I just want to hear you in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and also the issue of land claims. Your government has committed to putting in a bill to implement this declaration. Don't you think that by implementing this, your government, by slowing this down, you could create situations for other crises such as we are living now happen again? Don't you think that this crisis forces us to review the way or to look at our approach in terms of territorial rights for Indigenous people?
Je pense que
I believe that the platform, the commitment to calls for putting in a bill in order to implement the declaration of the UN, as you mentioned. That is truly a solution. The declaration will provide certainty in terms of the community, the industry, whether it's yes or no. Yes is yes, no is no. The First Nations, the Inuit, when they come around the table, as soon as they hear this idea, they have a choice to come up with their own ideas. They can approve they can raise some of their concerns. But the industry, the government, and the First Nations all together, the Inuit, the Métis, can work together to find appropriate solutions. Madam Minister, the Bloc Québécois is ready to move things forward if your government tables a bill in implementing the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights. I'm sure that my colleagues in the third opposition would want to work that way. It's important for the First Nations. The more we delay this, the more chance there is that this bill will die on the order paper. So what is the government waiting to move this forward? Yes, we're quite sorry that this declaration is not supported by the Senate, so that it wasn't supported in the last parliament. I believe that this is a collaborative process with the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis in developing the bill. And also working on the parliamentary process, similar to the Liberal platform. We believe that this bill will be put before Parliament this year. Last year, one of the experts invited by the committee, Mr. Eric Cardinal, stated that the policies on land claims was generally outdated. This goes back to 1987, and he criticized the fact that currently the federal government is not neutral in terms of land claims. So what are the intentions of your department in terms of modernizing this policy, and what do you think when Mr. Cardinal says that you should come up with a tribunal that recognizes ancestral rights similar to New Zealand, where there is a Waitangi tribunal? I'm fully in agreement with you. The policy is so outdated. But I believe that the First Nations doing good work, and also the province of British Columbia, and our public servants, that have been working to develop a policy for First Nations in the land claims process within that province. It's these actions that have brought about success in settling some of the land claims. and making it possible that people have access to their land claims rights, and also receiving support during discussions in or receiving assistance in getting a loan or paying back this debt. I think your time is up.
That we need to clean up. Are we good to go?
We're good.
Okay, we'll carry on then. Mr. Johns for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, ministers, for being here, especially in light of the crisis right now that we're all facing together. Minister Bennett, I want to talk about the systemic racism that Indigenous people in Canada are going through. A couple weeks ago, we were all invited, as you know, and Minister Miller was there to hear the story of Colton Boushie and the extremely difficult circumstances his family's dealt with, including the overt racism from our justice system. Colton's story is just one of thousands in Canada, given the sheer amount of discrimination and the scope of what needs to be addressed. Wouldn't it be appropriate, and you've heard me in the House on this, we need to get an answer on it, to invite the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people so that she can help us identify, so we can do the work as parliamentarians that needs to be done. Because we know Colton's family's asking for this, and we just need a clear answer. Yes or no, are you going to do it?
I think, Gord, you've raised really important points, and I believe that when we met with the Boushie family, as I have done on many occasions with Minister Lametti and Minister Miller, that this was a really important awareness of the racism that still is there in our justice system, in all of the areas of actually all, I mean, as we've learned through missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that whether it's education, health, justice, racism is everywhere, and the outcomes for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are really unacceptable. What we found in that conversation was that even what we are doing now for female victims of which in the family liaison units in all of the provinces and territories is really helping families navigate through a justice system that wasn't designed for them. And so it was very interesting to realize that, of course, if the victim is a male, there isn't that kind of supports and services. And so we became very open to having a look at how can we provide that kind of support for those families.
I wish I had more than 7 minutes, because we could have a long conversation on this. What's the resistance in terms of having the UN Special Rapporteur come? I mean, she's unbiased. It gives us an expert opinion, an analysis, a lens on this issue separate. I don't understand why the government's resisting.
So I mean, I hear you on this, but we are going to have to also settle this coast to coast to coast, bottom up, with all of the realities. We need the solutions that will be made in Canada.
We can do both.
And we're already working on that right here.
I just think having that external lens, I don't know why the government's not open to it. Shouldn't be opposed to it. And I'm urging you to take up their ask.
We'll look into it, Gord.
Okay. Currently, we know the government is fighting, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation order in court. It's opposing certification of a class action lawsuit that it previously indicated that it wouldn't oppose. And the government's also in court with AFN over child welfare. When will you call off the lawyers and actually just get to the table and settle this?
So thank you for that question, Gord, because in some ways that is my job, is to get out of court and to be able to settle these things at a table. As we learned with the 60 Scoop, that even though that was a case won in court, that what Marcia Brown and Chief Brown really wanted was language, culture, healing, all of those things that courts can't award. And so that we know when we get to the table that we're able to provide those additional services and that kind of support for the victims. And we hope that we will, as you know, the government is committed to make sure that all children harmed by the system will be compensated, but we also want to make sure that all the other things they need to have a secure personal cultural identity will also be in place.
I see these things get dragged out. First.
We don't want to go to court.
Yeah, well, you're
But some
spending piles
people
of money
want to
on
take us to court.
legal fees, and I'm sure the money people can tell us how much. But I did a question on the order paper, New Childhood Fishing Rights court case, $19 million just on government lawyer legal fees. Never mind court costs. I mean, we're talking tens of millions of dollars that could have actually paid for the quota to actually settle it. You spent more money fighting than it would have been to solve this issue. And, we hear across the cabinet that you're going to have a reconciliation lens at every member of cabinet. We're not seeing that. I've explained this to you, that the number one issue for coastal people in BC is salmon. We're not getting restoration dollars. The court case is still ongoing. The government continues to fight Indigenous people for the rights that are enshrined, as we know, that are protected under the Constitution. And why is your department, why are your leadership, we're looking to both of you, right, leading and talking to those interdepartmental cabinet ministers and getting these things done.
30 seconds.
Wasting money. Like it's the Couscousin project, I've talked to you about that. Reconciliation is dying here on the ground.
So I agree with you, and I think my colleague will talk a little bit about the North and the DFO, but we agree. This has to be a whole of government solution, and our deputy now chairs a deputy minister's oversight committee on treaty implementation, where all the deputy ministers come to the table, and we are seeing that we're making some progress there. But there's no question, Gord, that fish is probably my toughest.
We need your help. We need your help.
Okay, thanks on that. I've given a lot of leeway on this because we're here about the estimates, and we're going to be voting on those estimates in a short while. So if we have any more questions about the estimates, that would be appreciated. And Mr. Zimmer, you are next on a 5-minute round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I will ask questions about that. I think the pressing issue right now with even members in our parliament containing, just trying to keep the spread to a minimum. That said, we already asked previous minister questions about those very issues, so we'll move on to the estimates. I have before me, I just was up at the Yukon a few weeks ago, and I have before me just an announcement from 2017 that the Prime Minister announced that the Government of Canada is committed to contributing up to $247,381,000 to the Yukon Resource Gateway project. And this is for Minister Vandale. But troublingly, what we heard when we were up there talking to members of the government in Yukon, that only $277,000 of potential $360 million project has been spent in the last 3 years. Can you explain why?
And the original name of the project was what?
It is the Resource Gateway project, specifically.
The Resource Gateway project.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I understand, Minister, you got the job, I think, a few weeks before I got this job, so it's a big file, it's a big area to get caught up with. But I wouldn't mind just having a briefing back if you could find out why, because I think even the residents, especially in the Yukon, are wondering that same thing. And again, it speaks to numbers sound great when they're announced, and there's an expectation that it gets delivered on the ground, as you would know and expect in your riding.
Of course.
And the people of Yukon are expecting that project to be delivered. So I'll move on to my next question. I asked the question in the House of Commons, Minister, about the devolution in Nunavut. And we saw the comment a few weeks ago from the Premier Savikatak. I'll just read his quote. It really says it all. It says, "The creation of any new conservation and protected areas in Nunavut would have a significant impact on our ability to manage our lands and resources and carry out negotiations for decision-making, leading to potentially very serious consequences." That's February 20th, so fairly recent. The reason why this matters so much, again, to the Premier, and I can relate, I'm from northern BC. We just had a recent announcement of a caribou closure that's dramatically affecting our region, and it was to do with caribou. And the caribou closures, the rationale was that if we close the area to industrial development and maybe other things like skidooing, ATVs and those sorts of things, that will somehow increase the population of caribou. Sounds like a great idea. I think it's 2 million acres that have been closed out. But we saw and heard from experts that really they're saying it wasn't necessary. They're saying that in certain areas like Tumbler Ridge, the caribou populations were increasing without any closures impact to change that. We also saw in areas in British Columbia where there was 2 areas where industrial development isn't even there. Tweedsmuir Park is an example. No industrial development, but no caribou. So I understand the Premier's concerns that closing doesn't necessarily do anything, whether it's closures of marine areas and in interior lands areas. And I think what we're concerned about, and the Premier and I, is that this ever-increasing number, right now it was at, I think we have total closure amounts of 12%. And your government and your Prime Minister have said that you want to move to 30% closures across the country by 2030. That's in 10 years. We want to over double what the protected areas are. And we understand, guess where those areas come from? They aren't in Toronto. They're not in Vancouver. They're in my backyard, which we have natural resource development jobs that are produced there. Indigenous jobs and prosperity come from all that. And I want to give you time to actually answer the question. But
there's only 50 seconds left.
So devolution, that's when the Premier wants devolution to occur first.
Yes,
Your response.
listen, I've been to Nunavut twice in the last month. I've met with the Premier on a couple of occasions. We've had good conversations about devolution. I've met with the leaders of Inuit rights holders, NTI, who are a stakeholder in devolution, and we agree that devolution needs to occur because the heart and the soul of devolution is giving more control over land and waters to the people who live in the territory, and so that I think it's important to get to devolution quickly. So that they can have the control.
Can we get
over,
a commitment that no more
areas.
protected areas until devolution occurs?
It's something that came up in discussions with the Premier, and it's something that is ongoing, being discussed between our governments as well as the Inuit rights holders.
We're at time there. Thank you. Mrs. Ann, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've often heard that the effects of climate change in the north are felt at a rate of 3 times that of the rest of Canada. This is really concerning for any of us who are paying attention to climate change, including in Nova Scotia. We often mention this. Obviously, this has a huge effect on infrastructure, but also on the traditional ways of life of many Northerners. And I understand that Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada has programming to fund climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies in the north. So, first of all, can you explain to us why scientists are saying it's happening 3 times faster in the north, and also could you detail some of these programs?
Thank you for that very important question, and you're right on. The north is warming at 3 times the rate of the south. It's something that's very concerning. In my new role as Northern Affairs Minister, I've been to the Yukon, I've been to the Northwest Territories, and I've been to Nunavut twice since Christmas. And you could see the evidence on the ground. You could see I took a ride from Yellowknife to Butchko. And the highway was literally there was lots of bumps on it, and I believe because of permafrost melting. Permafrost melting is an incredibly important issue that's affecting all buildings, residential, commercial. It's affecting mining. The shoreline is eroding, and we have to do a better job on making sure that we address these issues. That's why I'm very proud to say there's over $32 million in the main estimate to support community and regional clean energy projects that reduce reliance on diesel for electricity and for heating. We have adaptation projects in northern and Indigenous communities, such as risk and vulnerability assessments, adaptation planning, community-based climate monitoring initiatives. This money will also support meaningful engagement of Indigenous peoples on climate policy through national Indigenous organizations as well as regional organizations, and to monitor changes in climate to plan and implement adaptation measures is incredibly important for the people that live there. We are investing $4 million in funding through the Northern Reach program to Indigenous and Northern communities to plan and construct renewable energy and energy efficiency projects, as well as to support capacity building. The program supports Northern communities, governments, and organizations to reduce diesel fuel use for community heating and electricity. We will also provide close to $10 million for climate change preparedness in the North program to support territorial governments and Northern communities to plan for and implement adaptation measures to prepare for a climate that's changing. We're providing through these estimates this morning, which will provide $9 million in funding to the First Nations adaptation program on the impacts of climate change, including flooding. $6 million to the Indigenous community-based climate monitoring program to Indigenous communities. The program supports Indigenous peoples to monitor climate impacts in their communities and on their traditional lands. Also, $5 million in funding through the Engaging Indigenous People in Climate Policy to help them at bilateral distinctions-based senior-level tables with the Crown. So you are right. It's the defining issue of our time. It's really the underlying issue of everything that's occurring in the North, and we are addressing it, but we need to continue the work we're doing.
Just have a half a minute.
Maybe I just was going to jump in that 20 years ago, as a new member of Parliament and member of the Arctic Caucus, we were in Tuktoyaktuk and went into the community freezer, and in which they dig into the permafrost, and you go down the little ladder, and there was water trickling down the wall of the freezer, trickling down the permafrost. And I think we've just, the science is one thing, but you can see it before your very eyes, and that's what the elders have been telling us with their Indigenous knowledge. And I was very pleased that when we were on the opening of the highway from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk, to know that there were sensors being put down into that whole highway by the University of Manitoba, I believe, so they can actually measure in real time what's happening to that permafrost.
Thank you very much. And we have a 5-minute question round with Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Schmel's taking my time.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry to keep bouncing around on you, Chair. Keep you on your toes. I think that's fun. Minister Bennett, I just want to pick up on where we left off last time, if we could. Just in terms of the departmental plan and setting and the goals that were set and not met, that type of thing. In your departmental plan, there were 8 goals that didn't specify targets or target dates. I can go over them if you want, but I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. The 8. Is there a reason why there was no target set or unspecified dates to achieve those targets? If you want, I can list some if you wanted. But
yeah, why don't you list them?
Okay. Percentage of First Nations that exercise options to collect, manage, and/or access revenues held in trust. That's 1. The number of litigation claims concluded. That's 2. First Nations communities undertaking solid waste management improvement projects. Percentage of First Nations communities where non-government revenues represent 25% or more of total revenues. Number of Indigenous businesses created or expanded. There is no target or target date. There are a few more, but I've got little time.
So in the what, by, when, and how, I think the deputy does that. So why don't you just take it, deputy?
Very happy to, and thank you for the question. I'm happy to provide a fuller debrief on this after, if that's useful to the committee. On a number of the different targets that we set, the realities will be very different for different communities, but they'll also be very much of an ongoing nature. So when you talk about waste management, things like that, these are issues that we will have to deal with for a very long period of time. And so in some instances, we have not a single date because we don't expect everybody to be at exactly the same position at the same time. And we have to work with the communities to figure out exactly what it is they want to achieve by a different point in time. So I can come back with a fuller briefing on exactly why we've
Well,
set.
I'm also just curious, we're 3 years into it, and there's still no target. I'm just curious what the roadblocks are here.
Sure. Well, and sometimes, and again, it will vary it'll vary target by target, but sometimes it's just the ongoing nature of the work itself. And so sometimes you don't have a situation where you arrive at a finite point. Concluding an agreement is a finite point, and it's binary. You've either met it or you haven't. Other things that you work on, it would be just of an ongoing nature. And so it's harder to set exactly what the target might be there.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. So if you are laying this out in your departmental plan, I agree, what you're saying is true. Why bother putting it in if you're not going to measure it or have any? Is it just kind of? I don't even know how to explain it, but
right.
I'm looking for clarification if I could.
I think, and again, happy to do a more full and detailed briefing on these specific pieces if that's, again, useful. But in some of the instances, we know that these things are important to do. We know they're important to tackle and to take on. But the nature of the activity itself and the time frame in which you do it makes it much harder than with some more binary things. So we don't want to lose the value and the importance of undertaking the activity. We want to make sure that's underlined. But figuring out exactly when you would say that you were done is a much harder thing to agree upon. It's more important to understand that they're actually being undertaken and being accomplished.
1 minute? Okay, 1 minute. Sorry, I might have to jump in here. I have one more question I want to get in if I could. In 2018-19, the government spent $15.7 billion and had 113 indicators. But I think this goes to your answer. The Department of Indigenous Services and the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations, that was for that department. Of those indicators, 31 or 27% were met, 20 were not met, so 17.7%, 52 were not, the result was to be achieved. So, in other words, not met and to be were pretty vague, as you mentioned, for a bunch of reasons. But the main estimates now say we spent $19.2 billion this year. Are always, better is always possible. So better than 20%, 7% success rate this time is.
5 seconds.
Hopeful? We look into the stars?
We're very hopeful, and we continue on with the work, and we continue to advance.
Because that's a lot of money for 27%.
Well, and it's an item that is continuing on for a longer period of time, too. So if we're still sitting at 27% at the end date that we've set for these things, that would be a big problem, of course. But we intend very much not to be at that point when we get to the end date.
We have our time up on that round. We'll conclude with Mr. Pelosi. 5 minutes, please, and then we have to get to voting on the estimates.
Well, appropriately, as I'm eating my plate of vegetables here that would cost like $50 in a northern community, I want to ask Mr. Vandell about the Nutrition North program, and maybe this is a bit of an observation, but maybe you can comment on this. I know this because I went to a food bank presentation in Thunder Bay. The food bank in Thunder Bay sends a lot of donated food to northern fly-in communities. And they had slides there showing the prices of food in the northern store in those fly-in communities. And they have the price and the price with the Nutrition North subsidy. And the differences were really trivial. It was like a little pot of strawberries was $9, and without the subsidy, it was like $8.50. And they had kind of repeated examples like this. And now in one of our earlier committee meetings, I mentioned this, and I'm not sure if it was Mr. Watson or someone kind of replied to this. Well, they'd been to Nunavut, and in Nunavut, the price of milk and cheese and things was fairly similar to downtown Toronto. And they said the amount of the subsidy is proportional to the distance from the built-up areas. So it seemed like this resulted in a real inequality that people in fly-in communities like Ottawa, Piscat, Pikangikum, Sandy Lake had very little subsidy, and basically nutritious food was unaffordable, whereas people in really far north communities, it was much more affordable. And maybe it's just a comment to look into, and I can ask a question.
No, I can try to address that. I mean, everything is incredibly expensive in the north because there's no roads, and that's what it comes down to. And I can understand that if you're going to the far Arctic to provide food, that it would be more expensive to get it there to a location that's closer. And that's just a very, very preliminary analysis. I do know that based on reviews that have been done through the Nutrition North Advisory Council, that at the end of the week, a basket of food in the north, whether you're, the basket of food in the north has been reduced. I won't say significantly, but it has been reduced because it's still too expensive. That's why we're putting more money into the subsidy end. That's why we're trying to find other programs like the Harvesters program. We're working with rights holders and people that live in the north on trying to be more creative. And it's an important issue that it's such a fundamentally important issue that we need to do better.
Okay, my other question was given to me, and usually with questions that are given to me, I throw them away and make up my own questions. But I like this question. It relates to British Columbia, and I have 3 kids in British Columbia, and 2 of them vote for Gord John's party, and one of them votes for Bob Zimmer. So I don't know where I went. So I don't know where I went wrong as a father. But I thought this was a good question. In September of 2019, Canada, British Columbian representatives of participating Indigenous nations in British Columbia co-developed the British Columbia Specific Recognition and Reconciliation Policy, also known as the BC Policy. I have heard that this, I haven't really heard, but the question says, I've heard that this new policy has removed most, if not all, of the obstacles that prevented First Nations in BC to fully participate in the BC treaty process. Can you explain what obstacles this new policy is removing? Which I really am wondering, what policies.
Well, and thank you for the question. And again, it follows up on Madame Berrier's the question that the comprehensive claims policy was really getting in the way. That it was based on loans. People had to sign away their rights, cede and surrender, extinguishment of rights. And so in this new BC policy, which I'm happy to table with the committee, that you will see that all of those impediments have been removed to the satisfaction of the BC Nation, First Nations in the treaty process, but also the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada. And so we believe this really will allow people who stalled in the treaty process, who didn't want to have to pay back $20 million in loans, that by forgiving those loans, by paying back, and particularly Bob was talking about Yukon, that up there where most of those nations had paid back their loans, were paying back the money to those communities, and that they now have that money to use on their priorities. So this has been, I think, a huge success, and I think it really is what now other nations are looking at, together with what the already self-governing nations have done in a collaborative fiscal policy, which really gives them the money outside of the Indian Act to run their government, and basically gets maybe 3 times more than the money they would have got in under the Indian Act. So it means that this has helped with the negotiation, but the incentive of why to do the hard work to get to self-governing is actually worth the hard work these nations are doing to get there.
Well, thank you very much. We're at time right there, and we're over time on our meeting, but I thought it was a very good, productive meeting. And we have some things to do, including the matter of the vice chair. Yes, did you want to?
Any business?
I'm sorry?
Are we in committee business now?
No, we're not. We have to vote on the estimates. And so on the main estimates, shall vote number 1 under Department of Indigenous Services carry? All in favor? That's carried, I believe. All in favor? Carried, thank you. Shall vote 5 under Department of Indigenous Services carry? All in favor? That carries as well, thank you. Shall vote 10 under Department of Indigenous Services carry? Hands? That's approved. Adopté. And now we go to the main estimates. Vote number 1 under the Canadian High Arctic Research Station. Shall that carry? That's carried. Shall vote number 1 under Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs carry? That carries. Shall vote 5 under Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs carry? That's carried as well. Vote number 10 under Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs carry. On 10, carried. And vote L15 under Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs carry. That's carried. That's all carried. Shall I report the votes to the House?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, we have some, yes, Mr. INAN de Sangari.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais
Mr. Chair, I would like to propose the candidature of Madame Berube to the Vice Chair of this committee.
Yes.
The deuxième? Oui, oui. All. Moved by INAN de Sangari that Madame Berube be elected as second vice chair of the committee. Any further motions? Does that motion carry?
Carried.
Carried. Merci beaucoup. Welcome. Bienvenue. And now,
thank you. You're welcome.
Suspend the open meeting now and move into camera for committee business. And so we'll ask anyone who is not needed here to leave, and we'll carry on with our committee business.